Hi, my name is Fisher-Reid, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about evolutionary medicine, evolution's impact on our health. I am an associate professor at Bridgewater State University. My specialty is in evolutionary biology, molecular ecology, and herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians. I generally work at the interface of lab and field, and so I'm usually combining genetics and ecology to try and understand evolution. Over the course of my career, I've worked with sharks, endangered turtles, salamanders, and I've primarily focused on salamanders today. So you might be wondering why I'm giving this talk. I'm not a medical doctor, nor do I directly study infectious disease or medicine. But this is a topic that I'm really, really interested in. And part of why I'm really interested in this is because of my dad. And so my dad is an MD, PhD. I grew up talking science and medicine with him. When I was in graduate school, I was a teaching assistant for an evolutionary medicine course. And I loved that course so much that I actually created my own version of it here at Bridgewater. And over the course of my career, I've been volunteering at Darwin Day events like this one, and part of Darwin Day is increasing public understanding of evolution. And I think medicine is a really great topic because it's something everyone's familiar with. And so it's one of the ways that I've found is a really powerful way to help people understand evolution. And so in today's video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick evolution crash course. So we'll talk about the two big ideas in evolutionary biology, which is common ancestry and natural selection. Then we'll talk a little bit about evolutionary medicine. We'll talk about the origin of the field and 6 reasons why humans are vulnerable to disease. And then I have a little bit to say on current events, so we'll talk a little bit about the evolutionary perspective of coronavirus and spillover. And throughout the talk, I'll try to mention some of these books that I have over here on the right. These are popular science books, so they are written for non-scientific audiences, and they're really well done, and they cover topics that are part of evolutionary medicine in really great detail, very easy to understand, and I'm a big fan of all of these authors. So first, let's talk a little bit about evolution. Evolution means change over time. That's what it means at its most simple, and that could be anything, right? So you could talk about music evolving, right? Or you could talk about computers evolving. All that means is that over the time that music has existed and computers have existed, they've changed, right? So then when we're talking about evolution in a biological context, we need to define that a little bit further. And so here, biological evolution means change in genes over time. So how do allele frequencies change from one generation to the next? And Darwin was really interested in this, even though he didn't have a good concept of genes. He knew there was something heritable, but he didn't know what it was. And so in 1859, he wrote The Origin of Species. And in The Origin of Species, he discusses these two big ideas. One is common ancestry, that all species are descended from a common ancestor and related to each other. And the other is natural selection. And so common ancestry you can see depicted in these different trees up here. And then you can see kind of artificial selection in pigeons. So Darwin was an avid pigeon breeder, and he really liked to kind of see what traits he could breed into his pigeons by selecting particular traits. So common ancestry makes sense of some really puzzling patterns in nature. Homology is kind of the vocab word that we use to describe how common ancestry is observed in today's living things. And so, for instance, if you look at vertebrates, here we have a human arm, a seal flipper, and a bat wing. You can tell that all of these species share a common ancestor because their forelimbs all have the same bone structure. So in every forelimb, whether it's used for grabbing things, swimming, or flying, you have a humerus, you have a radius and ulna, and you have your hand, wrist, and finger bones. And, these have been modified in the different groups for different things, but the same bone structure is found in all of them. And so we would say that these bones are homologous traits. They are similar in these different species because they were inherited from a common ancestor. Compare that to analogous traits, which are generally similar for reasons other than a common ancestor. Most often we see this in the case of convergent evolution. And so here you have 4 different wings, 3 in vertebrates and 1 in insects. And the 3 vertebrates, you have a pterosaur, you have a bird, and you have a bat. And again, the bones in the vertebrates are homologous, but the actual wing structure is not. So in the pterosaurs, you have 1 long extended digit. In the birds, you have feathers that attach to the bones. And then in the bat, you have several extended digits with the membrane between them. And so very different ways to fly, but they all evolved for the same purpose, right? To fly. So an analogous trait is similar for reasons other than common ancestry. The next topic that Darwin focused on was adaptations. And adaptations are traits that have evolved by natural selection. And so I have a little example over here with these birds. If you have the birds eating these caterpillars and they first pick off the bright purple caterpillar because it's really easy to see, and so they eat that one first, and in the next generation there are no purple caterpillars because none of them survived long enough to reproduce. Then in this generation, the orange caterpillars are the most obvious, and so they eat those. And so by generation 3, you now have a caterpillar population that is really well blended to this stick. And so maybe you'll get some birds that can find them, but more often than not, the birds can't. And so for natural selection to work, you need heritable variation. So you need this color that these caterpillars have to be heritable so they can pass it on to their offspring. Then you need there to be way more offspring than could possibly survive given the resources in the environment. And so some of them die, right? Some of them don't make it. So that differential survival and differential reproduction, some of them reproduce more than others, and they pass on their favored heritable variation, right? And so you end up with a population that is well adapted to the environment. And so common ancestry, natural selection, those are our 2 big ideas in the field of evolutionary biology. How do these apply to medicine? So what is evolutionary medicine? And I always like to start when I teach class with a definition. And so Wikipedia defines evolutionary medicine as the application of modern evolutionary theory to understanding health and disease. And so if you think about this for a second, think first, what's the primary focus of modern medicine? When you go to the doctor, why are you going to the doctor, right? What is the doctor going to do for you? The doctor wants to know how you're sick, right? And in knowing how you're sick, they want to be able to help treat you and relieve your sickness, relieve your symptoms. And so this is known as a proximate understanding. We're trying to understand what is making you sick, how are you sick, and how can we make you feel better, right? Evolutionary medicine comes at health and disease from a different perspective. And this perspective is one of why. Why do we get sick? And this is known as the ultimate understanding. And so the field of evolutionary medicine was founded by Randy Ness and George Williams. In 1996, they wrote this book, Why We Get Sick, which is, again, a popular science book, so it's pretty easy to read. And they lay out this field, this brand new field of applying evolution to medicine. And their main argument in the book is that understanding human illness should be informed by evolutionary thinking. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to give you an example from George Williams' research. So Randy Ness is a medical doctor, and George Williams is an evolutionary biologist. So Williams was really well known for studying an evolutionary phenomenon known as antagonistic pleiotropy. And those are two kind of obnoxious words, but they actually mean a very simple thing. And so pleiotropy means that you have one gene that affects more than one trait. And so as an example, there's a disease called phenylketonuria, or PKU. And PKU is a mutation in a single gene. Okay, so it's a broken phenylalanine hydroxylase gene. Because this gene is broken, phenylalanine, which is an amino acid found in food, builds up in your body and can cause problems. And so the problems it can cause: intellectual disabilities, abnormal gait or posture, musty body odor, light skin or hair pigmentation, and seizures. And so that's a lot of different traits, all affected by this one gene. So pleiotropy is one gene affects more than one trait. If you put antagonistic in front of that, it means that they're acting in opposition. So the gene is giving you something that benefits you, but also costing you something. And so that kind of balancing costs and benefits is one of the main focus points for evolutionary biologists. And so in the context of human health, antagonistic pleiotropy often means an early life advantage and a late life disadvantage. And as long as that net effect is a positive one, so that the early life advantage outweighs the late life disadvantage, the trait will evolve. And so let's kind of explore this antagonistic pleiotropy in the context of a human health example. And so why might we need early life advantages, right? Why, over the course of our evolutionary history, have they been selected for? So until very recently, infectious disease was a major cause of human mortality. And so these graphs down here show you two things. The A shows you childhood mortality from 1900 to 2000. B shows you the overall death rate from 1900 to 2000. And I want you to focus on this navy blue color here. The navy blue color is infectious and parasitic diseases. And so note how in the turn of the last century, around 1900, infectious diseases were responsible for many deaths in childhood and a high overall death rate. And over time, that blue line has basically gone to zero, right? So children are making it out of childhood, very low childhood mortality these days. And across all people, infectious disease is no longer a major killer. Instead, we have things like cardiovascular disease in purple, respiratory diseases in pink, cancer in red. And so what happened around the 1940s, right? What changed such that infectious disease mortality went to nothing? Around this time is when you have the development of improved hygiene, clean drinking water. You have better food, more food. You have vaccinations start to become very common. And you have antibiotics come on the scene. And lots of other medical and technological advances that make surviving childhood much more likely and make infectious diseases much less of a threat. But until very recently, right? So evolution works on long time scales. So if we now think about why we needed these early life advantages, one of the best examples of antagonistic pleiotropy in human health is Alzheimer's disease. And so one of the genetic markers for Alzheimer's is the epsilon 4 allele of the gene APOE, or apolipoprotein E. And so this gene is involved in transporting lipids, fat-soluble vitamins, and cholesterol around your body. And in the human population, there are three alleles: epsilon 2, epsilon 3, and epsilon 4. The epsilon 4 allele is associated with a higher risk of both Alzheimer's disease and atherosclerosis, which is a heart condition. And a very recent study in 2017 showed that there are at least 2 early life advantages in populations that still have high infectious disease mortality. So where that navy blue part of the curve is still kind of thick. And so in these populations, these are places in the world that don't have access to clean water, that don't have access to modern medicine, vaccinations, antibiotics. In those populations today, where infectious disease is still the primary cause of death, most of the people in the population are less likely to live to very old age than people in more urbanized, developed countries. And so the two advantages that Van Exel et al. Found was in babies that have one copy of epsilon 4, they are much more likely to have normal brain development while also having poor nutrition and diarrhea as young infants. So the ApoE epsilon 4 protects against cognitive development, while epsilon 2 and epsilon 3, the poor nutrition and diarrhea that they experience as babies leads them to have cognitive defects later in life. Another example of this is in women and fertility. So in women who are drinking open well or river water, and so these are water sources that are generally contaminated with parasites, the one copy of epsilon 4 gives you an advantage. It allows you to have more children. So on average, one copy of epsilon 4 has twice as many children than someone with no copy. And 2 copies of epsilon 4 allows you to have 3.5 times as many children as someone with 0 copies of epsilon 4. So this gene somehow helps women have higher fertility in the face of parasites and pathogens. So this is great. This shows that these genes really do have a benefit when you're in this environment where infectious disease is still your primary cause of death. However, in modernized populations, so places like the US, places like Europe, you have death from infectious diseases all but eliminated, right? You still get sick, but we treat them with antibiotics, we vaccinate, and so people live much longer, and they start to experience some of the costs of having these alleles that are only beneficial in a high infection environment. And so for ApoE epsilon 4, that includes Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease. And so this is a really interesting thing where this thing that we think is really detrimental and really bad for us was actually probably favored by natural selection, because until very recently, we had to deal with infectious disease. And I'll note that one of my colleagues here at Bridgewater State, Dr. Ken Adams, studies Alzheimer at BSU, and he actually is looking at ApoE4. And so it is a really interesting thing to think about and to study and to try and understand. So I'm going to pause here and restart in a second video. And in that second video, we'll talk a little bit more about why we get sick.